Our scripture reading is the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the women were bereft of their 2 children and her husband.
That may be 2 times in a row that Bob has been selected on the spot for scripture reading, and he's been given a bunch of names that are different and hard to pronounce. That was excellent. I had a teacher that used to say, as long as you just pronounce it the same way every time, everybody will think that you know what you're talking about. So I'm probably not going to do that. I may pronounce it differently once, twice, or 3 times different each time, just because some of those names are a little bit more difficult, but they're not the point of Ruth. We're beginning a study tonight on little books, big messages. There are some books of the Bible that are shorter than others, Ruth being the first one in my category of books that are short. Your category may be different, but we're going to be going through several books in the Old and New Testaments. For example, after Ruth, you've got a few shorter books. We may not look at all of them, but you have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Esther isn't very long. We may be looking at Esther fairly soon. When you get to the book of Lamentations, we're going to do an overview of the book of Lamentations. We're going to do an overview of several of the minor prophets. And then you get into the New Testament, and you have a lot of 1-chapter letters. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are short. 1st John has 5 chapters, but it kind of goes with 2nd and 3rd John, so those may be studied as a unit. We'll see. You've got Jude, you've got Philemon. Various other books are shorter books that we're just going to spend a little bit of time on, because often these shorter books, they get neglected. Well, what's in it for me? I'll tell you this much about Ruth, just as far as length goes. If you leave this building and head to my house using an audio Bible, you'll get to just the end of chapter 3. And then you could probably listen to chapter 4 before you knocked on the door, and it wouldn't take you more than a minute or so. Chapter 4 is shorter than 1, 2, and 3. But you have this book of Ruth, and it is a book with a big message, only 4 chapters, but it does have a big message. So let's kind of set the stage for Ruth. The book of Ruth takes place, the first verse gives us a good hint. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. There are 2 massive hints about what's going on just in that first part of the first sentence. In the days when the judges ruled. That backs us up to the previous book. Now, in our Bibles, you do have Judges and then Ruth. In the Old Testament, Jewish ordering of books, they may have it a little bit differently. Ruth is going to come near the end of the Old Testament, the way that they organize their Bibles. They will organize the writings at the end while we put them roughly in the middle before the prophets and minor prophets. But for Israelites, you have the law, and then you have the prophets, which are going to be, law, theology, and then you're going to have poetry and writing. So it all kind of comes together that way. But you have here in our books, fairly chronological, at least up to this point: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and then Judges. You read about the death of Joshua in the book of Judges and how there would be a generation that would come that would turn away from God. And the phrase that we get here, in the days when the judges ruled, that kind of churns your stomach a little, and then you find out a little bit more about how bad things were. There was a famine in the land. Why were there ever famines in the land of Israel? Because they turned away from God. And you see in the book of Deuteronomy, God saying, if you turn away from me, these things are going to happen, but if you come back, then you're going to be blessed. And so this is a time where Israel is not doing well, and this is going to be around the city of Bethlehem, that the Israelites are not doing well at this time. In fact, looking at the book of Judges, Judges chapter 18 and verse 1 gives us a picture. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, there was no king of Israel. Look at chapter 17 of Judges in verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Chapter 19 and verse 1. In those days, when there was no king in Israel. You have this repeated phrase through the rest of the book. And then in chapter 21 and the last verse, 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And you read how bad it gets by the end of the book of Judges. You're going to find out, by the way, and we'll look at this some other time, but the last couple of events in Judges happen in the early part of Judges. You have Moses' grandson mentioned, is about the only person mentioned in these last couple chapters by name. He's alive. That means during this about 300-year period, the really bad stuff happens at the beginning and it just gets worse from there. Whatever time it is in the Judges period, there's a famine going on. It is not a good time. And you have that setting for you as you see this family leave the promised land and go into wilderness. They go into Moabite territory. They go away from where God is supposed to be. And as you look at the book of Ruth, let's just consider some basic ideas and then we'll walk through the text, just giving an overview. Number one, you've got three main people. You have Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. Incidentally, the easiest people's names to pronounce in the book. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Naomi, also if you look at chapter 1 and verse 20, she wants to be known by another name. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But in chapter 1 and verse 20, she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. So she is very bitter by the end of chapter 1. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But she's mother-in-law to Ruth, whose husband Mahlon died in Moab. And after they leave and they're there for 10 years, he dies and she returns to the promised land when the famine is over. And she returns with our second main character, whom the book is named after, Ruth. Ruth, daughter-in-law to Naomi. She loves Naomi dearly, completely shedding her identity. When you get down to about verse 16 really verse 15 of chapter 1. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back, Orpah has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you will go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord, may Yahweh, do so to me more also, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Ruth sheds her identity of all things Moabite by the end of chapter 1. Her family, her nation, her gods, for the sake of tending to Naomi and knowing the Lord. And then you have our third major character, third major person, Boaz, a near kinsman of Naomi, because of her marriage to Elimelech. And he's a generous and kind Israelite who is going to give Ruth food and sustenance, not just so that they can survive, but thrive. And if you've never read the book of Ruth before, here's a spoiler. Ruth and Boaz get married. Like I said, it's not a big, long book. A lot of people kind of see the book of Ruth as a love story of sorts, kind of a love story in the Bible. Incidentally, it's if you want to look at it that way, it's a love story in a cesspool of sin. One of the darkest times in Israel's history is in the Judges period, and this stands in stark contrast. The events here stand in stark contrast to what you read about just a page prior and the pages prior in our Bibles. So you have these three main people, and then you have two key words. The first word being the word Redeemer, first key concept. The whole book is one of redemption. And with that, we see the word redeem or redeemer some 21 times. 21 times in 4 chapters. It's a big, major word. And the basic meaning of redeem means to buy back or to restore. And it's used exclusively in Old Testament theology within a family to help redeem another part of the family out of a difficult situation. There were certain situations in Israelite society, and you can read about some of these in the book of Leviticus and the laws governing them, where if somebody gets on hard times, they can essentially sell their land, and that land would still be theirs. Either they could buy it back, or in the year of Jubilee, it would come back to them, which would happen every 50 years. And they would have this ability, maybe another person from their family could buy back the land from them. Remember, the land promise was a huge thing for Israelites, and every family had their specific territory. And God took care of it. It was all about the wellness and the wholeness of family. And yet we do have another concept related to this, at least in the book of Ruth, somewhat, at least some of the same concepts from Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, that talks about what we usually call the Levirate marriage. And just to summarize that, if a man dies having no male offspring, there's a real potential loss of God-given family land and the end of that family. And so a brother, also known as a near kinsman, can take the widow as a wife and raise up offspring to perpetuate the family. And that would ensure that the land stays with the family and that the family can continue on in existence. From a technical standpoint, just so you know, this was optional for Boaz and not a law. We see that the other redeemer who had the right first didn't use that right. It wasn't a law, but he chose not to. He was closer, but he rejected the offer. God is working in this book as a redeemer, using others to redeem. And then you get to the word kindness. The word kindness only occurs 3 times. We'll look at that from the Hebrew word, but the concept is found repeatedly through the book. And this concept of kindness, it's from a word called hesed. And I don't know if that was mentioned in your sermon just a couple of weeks ago in Lamentations 3. Did you talk about hesed? So the steadfast love of the Lord, that steadfast love, that's hesed in Hebrew, probably pronounced differently, but that's how I'm going to tell you how to say it, or at least that's how I'm going to say it. Hesed, it's the easiest way to do so. But it comes from a concept in the Old Testament that really is hard to translate. Sometimes you'll see it kindness, loving kindness, steadfast love, and mercy, all sorts of different ways it's translated because so much is involved with that word. It has to do with covenant relationship. It has to do with deliberate action, often in deliverance from situations that a person cannot save themselves from. You think about the Exodus from Egypt. God showed hesed in bringing the people out of Egypt. It was something they couldn't do themselves. It's performed by someone who is stronger to someone who is weaker, normally. Performed by somebody who is stronger and has ability to somebody who is weaker and is unable. It is an extraordinary act of voluntary mercy and abundant generosity. That's why you're going to see it translated with words like mercy, grace, faithfulness, loving kindness, unfailing love, steadfast love. That's why Lamentations 3:22 through 24, the steadfast, the hesed of the Lord never ceases. All of those concepts come into view when you look at that. For just one more example, very quickly, turn to the book of Psalms and turn to the 136th Psalm. Psalm 136, keep your finger in Ruth, but Psalm 136 begins, "Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His," here's the word, "steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for His steadfast love endures forever and ever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for His steadfast love endures forever." Verse 4, 5, 6, all the way through, you're going to continue reading, "For His steadfast love endures forever." Psalm 136 is the hesed, the steadfast love psalm, emphasizing all of God's redemption and kindness and mercy again and again. When it comes to Ruth, like I said, it occurs 3 times, first here in chapter 1. In verse 8, "But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me.'" Now, Naomi, who doesn't believe that she has received hesed from God, kindness from God, still believes that God is the one who grants it. And in chapter 2 and verse 20, notice what we read and what Naomi says. Chapter 2 and verse 20, "Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'May he,'" that's going to be Boaz, as we'll see in a moment, "'be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead.' Naomi also said to her, 'This man is a close relative of ours and one of our redeemers.'" But notice Naomi sees a glimpse of God's hesed in the potential hopes of this man, Boaz. And then it occurs in chapter 3, and like I said, most of the time, that word refers to somebody stronger helping somebody who's weaker. But look at chapter 3 and verse 10 and notice how the word is used. This is Boaz speaking in the middle of the night, and he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last hesed kinder than the first, this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men who, whether poor or rich." At this point, at this juncture, Ruth is asking for Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer. And he says, this kindness of yours, you haven't gone after rich men or poor men or young men. He's apparently a bit older than her, and he's got some age on him, and he's not number one on that list, at least in his mind. And he says, this kindness, this hesed, this faithful mercy is greater than the first, implying that she's already shown him some kindness and shown others some kindness as well. And you do see that Ruth, in taking care of Naomi, bringing honor to the whole family, for her to be able to do that, and for pursuing a man who is apparently past his prime. You have Ruth practicing hesed, kindness. But, like I said, although the word occurs only 3 times, the concept is found throughout the book. When Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem, they're 2 destitute widows. Ruth is an immigrant from a country that's despised by the Israelites, and Naomi's friends, they can hardly recognize her because life has hit her so hard. She's become a bitter old woman. You can call me bitter. I'm no longer Naomi, but even worse, her family has been cut off from Israel. Again, when a man died, he would take comfort in the fact that he would live on and his family name would perpetuate through his children. The name of the dead would be honored and taken care of. But that's not going to happen with Naomi's family. Naomi's not upset and sad because she has no grandchildren. She's heartbroken because her family name is about to die out. That's where Boaz comes in. He allows poor immigrants to glean in his fields. He protects vulnerable women, and he provides for widows. That's what you see him doing in these first couple of chapters. Deuteronomy 24:17 comes to mind. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this: when you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Boaz is carrying out Deuteronomy 24:17-19, which, in the middle of a time when people have completely forgotten God and completely forgotten His law, says a whole lot about this man. He is doing exactly what God said to do and to show loving kindness. Lee, I don't know if you find out what the sermons are before you pick your songs, but at least 2 of them that we sang tonight, but one of them stood out in particular. I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. You know who Ruth was? She was poor. She was wayfaring, and she was a stranger. And she was traveling through a world of woe. I never really realized that song would perfectly fit her until we sang it tonight. Boaz, though, is a man who is showing hesed, kindness, to them. And in a sense, Boaz brings a whole family back from the dead. 3 main people, 2 main words, and 1 powerful God. You see God referenced 18 times in this book. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz all look to the Lord for blessing, understanding that all good things come from Him, and knowing that even the hand of the Lord can be against His people. They refer to Him again and again and again. And yet we only read 2 times in Scripture here in the book of Ruth where God is said to be directly acting, directly doing something. In Ruth chapter 1 and verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. The Lord had visited people, and the famine is over, for which they left 10 years ago. And then you don't see God directly acting, at least by the text standard, until Ruth chapter 4 and verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. When Ruth conceives and has a son, those are the only 2 times that we see God specifically, directly acting according to the text. But it's incredibly obvious as you read through this short book that God is working behind the scenes, so to speak, through the whole series of events. The great Redeemer displays his mercy and loving kindness in the book of Ruth. Very quickly, let's just look at the book by chapter. Chapter 1, from full to empty. As the scripture reading mentioned, Naomi is full at the beginning. She has a husband, she has 2 sons, and although they went away with no food, she considered her life full. She considered her life to have everything. Look at Ruth chapter 1 and verse 19. The 2 of them, Ruth and Naomi, the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full." Remember, she left in a famine, but she considered her life full because she had her husband and 2 sons. Chapter 1, going from full to empty. By the way, Naomi here says, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Look at verse 22. So Naomi returned. God's not going to call her Naomi, or God's not going to call her Mara. He's still calling her Naomi. He knows what's really going on. She wants to be called Mara. Change my name. This is my identity now. God says, you're still going to be called Naomi. And she'll see why fairly soon. But the text just simply doesn't call her Mara after that one time. From full to empty. Chapter 2, from hunger to hopeful. From hunger to hopeful. Verse 1, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And you see this question where Boaz is going to come sometime during this event, and he's going to say, "Who is that?" And they're going to say, "Well, it's Ruth, daughter-in-law of Naomi," and they're going to explain to him what's been going on. And Boaz goes to her and says, "Stay in this field, stay near my women. I've told my men to not harm you." Again, who is this? This is a poor wayfaring stranger. She is part of a family, the Moabites, who are absolutely hated by Israel. And Boaz says, "You stick near to them," and he commands his men to even drop some of what they are gleaning so that she can have even more. And by the time you get near the end of chapter 2, you see that they go from hunger to hopeful. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field till evening. She beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, and she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. She was given food at lunch and had leftovers. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept near the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. They go from hunger to having a little bit of hope. And then chapter 3. Chapter 3, Naomi, her mother-in-law, the text begins, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz, our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he's winnowing barley in the night in the threshing floor." And Naomi tells Ruth, here's what you need to do. Wait till evening, put on some oil. It's going to be a scented kind of oil. Clean yourself up and put on some oil, some kind of perfumey scented oil. And at night, after he has eaten and drank and all that, and he is in bed, go and uncover his feet and lay at his feet. Now you know what the oil's for. And lay at his feet. I'm kidding. He's going to wake up from this. And she has this plan. And I'm just going to tell you about all of these cultural nuances. They're different than our cultural nuances. And nobody's going to give you a satisfactory answer as to why exactly Naomi knew this was going to work and that this was a normal thing in their society. You don't really read a whole lot about it. But this is Naomi's plan, and by the end of it, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he asks who she is. She says, "Well, I'm Ruth," and he says that other kindness thing, and he says, "Wait, there is a closer Redeemer. If he will not redeem you, then I will, and I will go to him tomorrow." And so there's this anticipation. She goes back and he has essentially given her almost a dowry kind of offering. She has to carry it, holding it up in her clothing, going home and all that. And she brings it all home, and her mother-in-law says, "Well, what happened?" And she tells him, and she says, "All right, wait, he's going to take care of this today." So you go from plans to anticipation. And then chapter 4, from empty to full. Chapter 4, from empty to full. As I said, chapter 4 is a bit shorter. And you see another weird cultural thing having to do with feet. Chapter 3 is a weird cultural thing with feet. Chapter 4, it's in Scripture. And what they used to do at that time was they would take their shoe off in an exchangement agreement. In the circumstance here, you had Boaz get this nearer redeemer, kinsman redeemer, and 10 elders of the city. And they all sat around, and he said, "Hey, do you want this land?" And the guy says, "Yes, absolutely. If you do, you're also going to get Ruth." "Oh, no, I don't want that. Don't want to have to deal with that." And then he says, "All right, you have denied it. Then I will take it." And he said, "Absolutely, you take her." And then he has to take off his shoe, and he has to take off his shoe, and they exchange these sandals. Again, different culture. And in fact, it's so different that when you read it, the text says, "at that time." It's like they didn't do that even after this was written in their culture, but that's what was done. And the kicker for the book of Ruth comes at the end of chapter 4. You have God blessing Ruth with conception, and she bore a son. Verse 14, the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Here is the tremendous reality of the book of Ruth. The seed line of Christ was on a hair's breadth from being wiped out of existence. 4 truths about God. Number 1, He will work out His plan. God worked out His plan to bring about David, who is eventually going to bring about Christ. The rest, 18 through 22, is this lineage history to get to David. God will work out His plan. Number 2, God never forgets the forgettable. So different was Naomi that the people that had known her whole life, after not seeing her for 10 years, questioned, "Is that really her? She's back? What's going on?" God never forgets the forgettable. Naomi is one person in the midst of one of the darkest times in Israel's history, and God did not forget her. Number 3, God works in the mundane. God often works in the mundane. You read this "just so happened" kind of phraseology throughout the book of Ruth. And it happened, just so happened. And it screams God's providence. Often God just works in the mundane. We may want to see this big grandiose sign and all of those kinds of things, but God works through the normal course of life to bring about His plans. And number 4, God forgives to the uttermost. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever." Yet of Ruth, she's in David's line, and thus she's in Christ's line. How much do you suppose it meant to Naomi? And how much more to God for Ruth to say, "Your God shall be my God"? It's a little book, but it is a big message. When we think about Jesus being our Redeemer, consider the story of Ruth. Jesus has redeemed us and reclaimed us for an inheritance, our place in the paradise of God near the tree of life, which we lost because of sin. In a very real way, this sick and fallen world is a wilderness compared to what God has in store and what His plans are. And through Jesus, our Redeemer, our exile, our bitterness, our desperation, and our hopelessness are coming to an end. Ruth asks Boaz to spread his wings over her and Naomi. Do you remember when Jesus says to the Israelites standing over the city, "O Israel, Israel, how I long to gather you as chicks underneath my wings, but you would not." But God has spread His wings, Christ has spread His wings over us and showed us kindness while we were dead, and certainly shows us kindness now that we are alive in Him. Ruth isn't just a love story, but in a very real way, it is the story of God's love for us. For those who have not put on Christ in baptism, if you want to do so, you merely must believe in Him and trust that He is the Son of God, turning away from sin and confessing that Jesus really is the Son of God, King and Lord, and that He will be that for your life. And then you can put Him on in baptism. You can be redeemed by the precious blood of the Lamb and walk in the steadfast love, the hesed of the Lord. Can we help you tonight? If so, come as we stand and sing.